Hello and welcome to Audiobooks All Day. We wanted to start off this episode by saying something really, really important. And that is that last night Kevin listened to a milestone, and I want him to talk a little bit about his milestone and a little bit about the story behind it.
Yeah, so in 2017, well, I guess a little bit of background. I've mentioned on this podcast, for anyone who happens to listen to it, that that I have dyslexia, and that has been, that was a real challenge for me growing up. And I've always loved books and stories, but especially going through high school and in college, I had a lot of frustration around reading because I just would read so slow. And but there were all these books that I really, really, really wanted to read. And one day, Jeff shows up. We lived close by each other at the time. We still do, but we were in different places. And he said, "Kevin, have you ever heard of the app called Overdrive?" And I hadn't. And Overdrive is was the precursor to Libby, which is essentially a library app. It's a digital library app where you're able to check out books and, by extension, audiobooks. And the best part of the platform is you're able to check out audiobooks. So, before, if I wanted to listen to an audiobook, which I love listening to audiobooks, I had to and buy it myself or go check it out at the library. And it was just something that I just didn't do that often, or at least as often as I'd like. So I now had access to all these books, and I started listening. And that was the very end of May of 2017 is when I first downloaded Overdrive. Now Overdrive is gone, and now it's just Libby, and since then I've adopted Audible and a bunch of other things. But at that time, I started recording my books. I record, what book I read, how long it is, who's the author, the narrator, and because I love spreadsheets, that's kind of like my thing. Well, it's not my thing. It's just something I do a lot, and I record most things that I do. And so I started recording books. And last night, I listened to my 1000th book since I started recording. So in all that time, I've been listening to books. And from May of 2017 to last night, I've listened to 1000 books. So that's my milestone, and one that seemed absolutely impossible when I started listening. Somebody who had only read a handful of books in his entire life, being able to be exposed to so many ideas and stories and characters and processes of thought. It's, you know, we do audiobooks all day, not just because it's fun and not just because people like audiobooks, but because audiobooks can change lives, and we're two examples of that because they've changed our lives, and I certainly can say that they've changed mine. And I just love this journey, and that's why we're doing this.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. But please also say what book you ended with, because it has kind of
Ah,
an interesting story.
so the very first book that I recorded, having listened to, it was a book, was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Huge Harry Potter fan. Listened to all the books many, 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 many times. And up until recently, the only ones that you could buy were the Stephen Fry, or not the Stephen Fry, the Jim Dale versions. There were the original recordings, whose the narrator escapes me, and I had listened to the first one of that. But Jim Dale was my guy. Loved Jim Dale. And recently, I know he started doing it as a podcast several years ago, but just recently on Audible, they started selling the Stephen Fry narrations. And so I started with Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by Jim Dale. And last night, my 1000th book was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, read by Stephen Fry. So kind of this cool little circle for me. And yeah, so that's where I ended and where I started.
Well, congratulations. I think that you made a great point about how audiobooks can truly change lives, and that's why we're doing it. And today we're talking actually about, a life that was changed a lot through a book that they wrote, and we decided to cover Hillbilly Elegy today by JD Vance.
Yeah. And Hillbilly Elegy is a biography written by JD Vance when I believe he was 31, or was he 33? 31, I think. He says it right in the beginning. And he starts off the book, he's like, "Hey, I haven't accomplished anything in my life besides graduate from Yale Law School, which 200 people do every year. And I can tell you that most of them don't deserve a memoir." And he said, "But I'm writing this memoir because I grew up in unique circumstances, in a culture and in a place that is unique and largely unknown to the country at large." And he's talking specifically about the Appalachia area of the country in the Rust Belt, so parts of the South, Ohio, Kentucky, and I don't know if people really consider Ohio part of the South, but Kentucky, Arkansas, and where the poor white working class Americans live, and talking about his experience of growing up in, as he puts it, hillbilly country.
The thing that struck me immediately about this book was how different it actually was from the movie and how the same it was. So I actually had seen the movie before, and so maybe a lot of you listening have seen the movie. It was amazing. I definitely believe that Glenn Close should have won the Academy Award for Best Actress in playing Mama. She was amazing. But when I watched that, I'm really watching the human story of JD Vance. But when you read the book, this is much more of a commentary of what has happened in these communities over the past 50 years and kind of where they're going. The book essentially starts out like most autobiographies do, with kind of chronicling the life sketches of people that have come before. And the characters that play the biggest role in JD's life are his sister, his mom, his grandparents, and what you don't see in the movie is also his dad. And that plays a big role. And he kind of first sketches a little bit about his grandparents. And his grandparents had grown up in eastern Kentucky, and she had gotten pregnant when she was 13, and they left to try and find a better life for themselves, and they wound up making it all the way to Middleton, Ohio, which is where they would wind up establishing kind of their base. While they would wind up losing that child and a bunch of others, I think she had a total of 9 miscarriages, or one child died and then 8 miscarriages. She did wind up having another daughter, which would then become JD Vance's mom. And it kind of chronicles a little about her early life as well. And I don't know if you wanted to take any of that.
Yeah, it was just, what really struck me about all of this is, I think there were two things. One of the big themes in the book is that, as he puts it, hillbilly culture is centered around loyalty and family, and an incredibly strong family nucleus that is not as common, in a sense where uncles and aunts and grandparents are constantly together. A very strong nucleus. They live next to each other. They're constantly over at each other's house. They're completely involved in each other's business. It's a very different structure than, one that I'm familiar with. And how when they left Kentucky to go to Middletown, Ohio, that they left that behind. And at the same time, there was a lot more opportunity in Middletown, Ohio. So they were able, JD's grandpa was actually able to get a good job at Aramco, I believe is what the company was called. It was a large steel company that made steel for cars. And how even just as he's giving his family background, he's outlining two really big points throughout the entire book. One is how family is so integral to this family, and how that was a big struggle for his grandparents, being away from family, but also how and just how different that situation was, and how that'll play in and out of JD's life, and also the economic opportunities that as they got into what they felt was much more of a middle class, his grandparents, some of the challenges of moving up had with their culture, and then also how dependent that area was, the Rust Belt, on that type of jobs, and how, as economic trends changed and jobs moved away, how that impacted the culture as a whole.
Yeah, maybe just to touch on that briefly was, Papa was and Mama, they had a tumultuous relationship, but they were able to make money and they were able to own a home and they were able to live in the suburbs. But as factory jobs wound up moving away, what would happen is that people would, have bought a home and they couldn't move. So the people who were richer or, higher class, they were able to move and to continue to grow. But the people that had bought a house who were a little bit more poor, they could not afford to move. So what would happen is that as these factories would spin up, it would bring a lot of people. And then as the factory would move, it would leave only the poor people. And something that I like that JD said at the very beginning too was, he says, like, there's no villains in this story. There's just people who are trying to live. And I thought that was a really good perspective, because nobody here is intentionally trying to be self-destructive, for just being self-destructive sake. I think that what he's trying to say is that this whole pressure on these communities to be a certain way is really what erodes the character of the person, as opposed to them just doing it themselves. Although he doesn't give people outs if, there's people not working, he calls it out. So his mom was super smart. She was the salutatorian. I don't know. That word was so big that I didn't even quite. She was the top of her class in high school. Super bright, had a lot of potential. Got married, got pregnant at 18, and essentially started her life. And in so many ways, it seemed like her life was frozen in that moment. JD's early life was plagued by a few different factors. One is that he had to move a lot. The next part is that, the roving partners for his mom, the constant in and out of male figures, and the coming to grips with, one of the things that I thought was so interesting was him trying to come to grips with the fact that his sister was his half sister. And when he found that out, it just like broke him, and he would just cry and cry because, how could he not, have this be his total sister? But bottom line is, early on, JD has all of these weird contradictions. Why am I moving? Why is my dad not here? Who are these other guys? Blended families. And he's like, people would ask him, tell me about your family. And he's like, well, I think I have like 20 siblings, because I have my actual siblings, and I have my half siblings, and then I have, the family of my mom's former spouses, and then I have the future spouses that she's probably going to have, and those kids. So I'll just kind of like lump them all together, and I have a humongous family. So like trying to come to grips with that as a kid was super difficult for him. And then obviously there was a lot of, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and I think,
substance abuse.
Yeah, substance abuse. I mean, he was maybe, I remember a story where, somebody had walked in, maybe it was his sister, and they were drinking, and he was, like 11 or 12, and he was totally drunk. And anyway, the story is mainly just how JD reflects now on his life being 31, going, how in the world did I get out of this? What are the pressures that are on this group of people? And then how was I able to separate myself from it? Really how he's able to do that is because of his mama and papa, as he credits it, specifically his mama. And one of the stories that I really liked in this is, as JD's growing up, Mama at some point winds up taking him in. So from all of his from all of his elementary school years, he's bouncing around, he's doing all these different things. But then during grades 10, 11, and 12, he lives with Mama. And he contrasts
Just
those two
Mama.
things. Huh?
Just Mama.
Yeah, just Mama. And what he, as he's going through, and he's like, well, I was less in shape, less inclined to study. I was a worse student. I had worse friends, during my elementary school years. But then during high school, I had better grades, better friends, better vision of my life. And essentially what he boils that down to was the biggest differences between the two situations. He's like, one, I didn't move in high school. I never moved. I stayed in the same place every day. The second thing, the family was consistent. It was just Mama. There wasn't a bunch of people coming in disrupting the dynamic. And then three, there was chores and responsibilities that he had to do. And first of all, Mama has like the most classic phrases of all time, most of which are not appropriate for this podcast. But, I just remember she would say something to the effect like, she's like, you need to get to studying, get to work, and get off your butt and come help me take out the trash. And it's like, she is so good.
My favorite Mama story, he tells it, I think she's like 6, and somebody's stealing their family cow.
Oh, yeah, when she's 12, yeah.
12, yeah, and there's 2 people stealing the family cow. So she goes inside, grabs the shotgun, and shoots one of them. And as the person's on the ground, she goes in to finish the job, and her dad stops her. And it's just kind of, that mentality is Mama. She is tough and mean and vulgar, and all the other family members would be like, man, Mama is so hard on you. And he's like, Mama's the best. Mama is what I need, like he was saying. And I think this is a really interesting, due to all the instability at home, when JD's still living with his mom, there are a lot of investigations from child services. And JD learns very early on in his life that from his perspective, it is best for him to lie and say everything's fine. The reason is that child services doesn't consider Mama an appropriate guardian. So if he were to enter the system, he would be taken away from all of his family infrastructure, from his sister, from Mama, from Papa, from his mom, who, while they have a tumultuous relationship, and like Jeff said, he doesn't cut her any slack, he certainly doesn't try to villainize her. He loves his mom, and he has a relationship with her, and he wants to build that relationship despite the innumerable troubles and hurdles that they face. And I just thought it was so interesting that, and he goes on to say, these systems are set up to help kids, but that in his situation, and he goes on, like Jeff said, to chronicle, like, as I was just with Mama, I was able to turn my life around because of that consistency, because she loved me, because she was there for me. She may have been rough. She may have been what nobody else would have considered an appropriate guardian, but she was what he needed. Now, I'm not trying to say that, hey, if somebody has a family member, that's always best for the child. Situations are complex, but that's just what he's identifying, that these situations are really, really complex. And that on the outside, Mama was this gruff, shoot you to get off her lawn type of character. And that's how she was in real life, but that she was exactly what he needed.
Yeah, and I think one of my other phrases that she said, she's like, and they can kiss my ruby red butthole. And I was like, ew, that's the worst phrase of all human history.
That's the worst.
It is the absolute worst. But yeah, and that is so interesting. And then, as JD gets older and now he has an opportunity to go to college, the first person in his nuclear family to go to college, he gets accepted to the Ohio State, a big state school, which is so funny because he kind of talks about like the Ivy League. And at least for me, like I never even considered going to the Ivy League. Mainly, I don't know. I never even thought about it. It didn't seem all that valuable to me, to be honest. Like, I mean, it's not that, I can see that it's valuable for other people, but I never thought, oh, right, I'm going to apply to Yale or Harvard or Stanford. And I didn't, but he's talking about the state school. And then he realizes that he's not quite ready, and he makes a really independent decision to join the Marine Corps. And so he serves as a public affairs NCO, goes to Iraq, has a lot of really great experiences. But as he's in the Marine Corps, because he says like they pretty much treat you as if like you were just born or something, like that you have no knowledge of anything, and that's how they treat every single person. And that's true. And he was saying, like he would learn about finances, and he would learn like, oh, I guess it wasn't okay to, be eating fried bologna every day, or, eating at Cracker Barrel and Taco Bell every day. Like, oh, like that's not okay. And, he would start to look at, oh, like this has a lot of sugars. And, he started to realize, like, as he was taught more about life, that there was this really big juxtaposition to how he grew up. And he just was realizing, like, wow, people in my communities, they don't even know this stuff. Like, they have no idea that, that sugar is bad for you, essentially, And he would start to say, like, as he would learn more and as he would grow in the Marine Corps, his life in Appalachia would seem ever more contrasted. It was almost these two different worlds. Then he would go to, the Ohio State, and then he would go to Yale Law School. And it was like so funny because they were saying, like, apparently like a professor at Yale Law School wanted to ban people from state colleges, like, to go there. It's like, oh, okay, all right, you're awesome, got it. But
Wow.
I just, like, it was so funny to, like, hear his take on Yale and how, and I'm sure it's very special. I'm sure it's very great. But then he talks about having a network, and he says, like, oh, people who really make it in this world, like, they don't send out their resume. They call up on their uncle, they call up their friend, they position themselves with other people. So he talks a lot about networking. And then he kind of is showing, essentially, now he's on this new pathway. He meets this great girl, and then now that he's in this phase of his life, now he's looking back and he's going, like, wow, there was a whole lot of things about my life that wasn't okay, and that people don't even know that it wasn't okay. And now you're kind of almost this outsider. I was this person that was in the system, but now that I'm out of it, or in this community, but now that I'm out of this community and living and doing this other thing, now this community, like, I've lost a little bit of touch with it, and it's lost a little bit of touch with me. But I do think it's really amazing that his sister was able to get married so young and stay married and have a great family and great kids, and that he was able to do some great things. So despite all this dysfunction, for whatever reason, both he and his sister were able to raise above a lot of the patterns, which I think is so crazy difficult. Because the book talks about, like, how the Mama and Papa had really economically raised themselves much more than any of their other family, like you were saying, that was still in the hollers in Arkansas or
Kentucky.
But while they had raised themselves up, their emotional, like, the emotional stability of the home was really wrecked. And so, it produced a very emotionally volatile person in their mom. But for whatever reason, they were able to make it work.
One of my favorite stories from his time at Yale is he's had a big interview with a really prestigious law firm, and the waitress comes by and says, "Would you like sparkling water or regular water?" And he says, "All right." And in his mind, he's like, "All right, your restaurant is fancy, but sparkling water? Come on. What, just calling water sparkling? Like, how pretentious can you get?" And so he's like, "I'll have the sparkling water." He's like, "Fine, I'll play along." And then he drinks it, and he's at the table, partners of big prestigious law firm, the top of it, all of his classmates, and he just spits it out right over the table. And he's like, "What is this?" And he didn't realize that it was carbonated. And throughout as he makes this move to the Marines, to Ohio State, to Yale, he constantly talks about the things that he's learning, things that seem very obvious, things that seem very simple. And he goes on to talk about how, Jeff was mentioning, sugars, looking at things. He tells the story of when he said, I took something along the lines of, I took a Yale classmate to Cracker Barrel for the first and last time. When I grew up, it was Cracker Barrel. That's a exciting place to go. It's like an occasion. And now it's just like a greasy spoon. And he was able to get so much perspective by traveling to the Marines, by going to Ohio State, by going to Yale. His worldview opened up a lot, and he was exposed to a lot of new ideas. But what he contrasts that with so much is that there weren't those opportunities given to him growing up, to his family members growing up, the way that, their culture is and their circumstances put them in is that these were things that may seem obvious and like, oh, the parent was neglectful, but they're not things that the parent was exposed to either, that the parent had the ability to learn. And talking about, Jeff was mentioning the concept of social capital, of having other people, do stuff for you, and all of these different social rules. And he talks about how a lot of that big difference, these social rules are what keep down a lot of people from poverty, because he tells story after story of all these hijinks, all these problems of when he goes to these high-powered interviews. He calls his girlfriend at a different interview, which is at a dinner, and he's like, there are too many forks. I don't know what to do with these forks. And she walks him through with how to, eat. But it's just a concept that was just so foreign to him and so intimidating. And I think, when you look at, the idea of what does it take to get a credit card, having a bank account, getting car insurance. He never mentioned car insurance in the book. I was just throwing out, but there's so many complexities to our life, from, like insurance to what we do for work and mortgages. And there's so much complexity that if you grew up in a place that wasn't fostering, wasn't helping to teach you those things and wasn't helping to foster that sense of being able to navigate through the world, you're going to feel very helpless. And that's a really big theme that he hits upon, is that a lot of the people who are stuck in the situations that he was able to move from feel that their actions don't matter. They feel helpless.
Yeah, and actually to that point, right after Hillbilly Elegy, I actually started listening to the book My Life by Bill Clinton. So it's his autobiography. And it just struck me in reading it, because I was like, yeah, he's from Arkansas. He's kind of from the Rust Belt, but, a different time. And I kind of thought, it'd be fun to listen. Wow. I am so grateful I did. Because when you put the two books side by side, I can see a very similar story. Yet two completely different outlooks and perspectives on those experiences. So for example, we just talked a lot about JD's life, and Bill Clinton had a lot of the same struggles. His dad died 3 months before he was born. So he was born to a single mom. His grandparents, who were also named Mama and Papa, because he's from, Arkansas, he's from the Rust Belt, were heavily involved in raising him up. He was, he had a father figure that came into his life who would become his stepdad, and eventually his namesake. He would take on Clinton as his last name from this man. But Bill Clinton faced abuse. He was also kind of chubby. He was, ridiculed. His stepdad took out a gun in front of Bill Clinton and shot it at his mom and missed. These are really horrible situations, that happened to him. And he talks about, eventually moving over to Hot Springs, which is also in Arkansas. And, he was living really close to a brothel. He's seen a lot of really horrible things. But the thing that Bill Clinton does not do, he does not share his feelings about them. So where JD experiences all these feelings, and then he talks about them, and then he looks at the impact that he had on his life, there's all these things, and this is the impact that all this, cumulative baggage had on my life. Bill Clinton doesn't do that at all. He just looks at it and he's like, this is how it was. And you know what? If he would have started complaining right about his life situation, my guess is he came from a time, he's grown up in the 50s, where everybody else who was also growing up in the 50s who would have read that book would have been like, yeah, whatever, my dad beat up my mom too. Or, yeah, so what? And then we kind of progressed a little bit as a society. And now the contrast between JD Vance's existence and your everyday Americans is a very wide gap. But for Bill Clinton's existence and then everybody else in America at that time, the gap was so much smaller. And so while he faced a lot of hardships, it wasn't unique hardships, And I'm not saying that JD Vance's is a unique hardship, but I think probably statistically, that type of life is a lot rarer than it would have been in Bill Clinton's time. And so when you play the two people side by side, both political superstars, very young in life, both people who went to powerful, who got out of it through education, who had abusive childhoods growing up, moving around a lot. One, though, almost romanticizes all of it. And then the other one confronts the hard truths. And you kind of look at, like, that's kind of today. Like, now we look at these things and we're able to call them what they are. But Bill Clinton doesn't do that. He talks a lot, and it's funny because they both start talking about family and how important that is, and especially like the family stories and legends. And you told that story about how Mama, for JD Vance, almost killed that guy, and like how much JD loved that story because it just shows how much Mama was great. Well, Bill Clinton has those exact same kind of stories of these extreme violence, but yet they were so lauded because it was done in the name of family or done in the name of community. And anyway, it's just very interesting to listen to the two books, and similar circumstances but completely different kind of outcomes. And the other thing, at least at this point in the book, and I'm very early in it, so I can't say this definitively. But the Bill Clinton. Is that he does not attribute, at least at this point, any of the pain of his childhood to any of his future sins. So he talks about, because he has a religious conversion actually very similar to JD Vance's. It's really crazy. And but he doesn't say like, yeah, and all this baggage really had a big time effect on me. Seeing, hearing, the only thing he really talks about that gunshot was he's like, I just could not believe how loud it was because I hadn't been that close to a gun being shot. And I'm like, it's crazy that we're talking about that, like the facts of the case rather than the influence on that child, but he doesn't attribute any of that. Whereas JD Vance, he talks a little bit about his, he now is married to his wife Usha, and he realizes that there's only really two ways to communicate when you're having an argument. Either you yell and scream or you totally withdraw. And he wasn't going to yell and scream, so he would just totally withdraw. But he would talk about, hey, but that behavior was characteristic of what my mom would do. And so he's able to draw that line. Well, Bill Clinton was around a lot of womanizers growing up. He was around a lot of infidelity. He lived next to a brothel. He would call it and be on hold so that other people couldn't, call in because he thought it was funny. But there's nothing, at least at this point in the book, that says, hey, maybe any that impact had on my life. And then I start extrapolating a bunch of stuff that is probably not true. But, I even think of like Hillary and Bill's relationship and thinking of like, wow, Hillary is stuck by him through so much, but she also probably understands the full story. I think that there's so much there for Bill Clinton that is not in there, and all of the trauma that he's now kind of come to grips with. And Hillary's seen that. Maybe it helps her love and understand him a little bit more than he would have, because both of them have really unique stories. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to share that with two, pretty dynamic young political figures, kind of coming from essentially the same spot in the same circumstances, two totally different books or takes on their experiences.
Yeah, that contrast is really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know any of that about Bill Clinton. I mentioned one of the things that I've loved about reading audiobooks was learning so many things and learning perspectives and stuff. And this book helped me get a glimpse into a world that I don't know, that I am not familiar with. That's not been my community. Those aren't my neighbors. It's not something I've had experience with, for whatever reason. And I think that that's one of the beauties about a book like this, is that it gives you an insight into a group, and it helps you understand their unique trials. It helps you understand, them and their attitudes, and it helps you, understand like maybe why this group doesn't always fit in the mainstream, and why that poses very unique challenges to them. And one of the things that I thought was really, really, really impactful from the book, JD talks about all these different things, talks about the impact on his life, and talks the impact of everything else. But he never eliminates personal responsibility. He never says, well, because these things happened. Yeah, he said, because these things happened, I'm doing this, like Jeff said with the example of how he dealt with an argument. But he didn't finish that and say, well, that's just how it is. It was, well, now what am I going to do about it? He talks throughout the book. I mentioned child services. He talks about public services. He talks about, different political things that have, or different services that have impacted his community and his people positively and negatively. But the thing that he never takes away and never gives, he, even with his mom, he says like, hey, I understand that some people are predispositioned to addiction and that her addictions have really harmed her and that she's had a lot of challenges. But at the same time, he also said, but she's also made decisions that have been, that have negatively impacted me. And that, at the end of the day, that we need to, his point is that at the end of the day, we need to take personal responsibility for what we're doing, that we can allow for circumstances, we can understand those things, but that we can't wait for somebody else to change our lives. And that's the point that he makes, throughout the book, but really strongly at the end. And I thought that was a really, really interesting take, especially given where he's come from.
Yep, powerful stuff. I would highly recommend anybody listening to this book. I think it does provide that little gateway into a group of people who I personally would love to know. I think that there's so many strengths to that community, and hopefully society can continue to develop, and everybody, and especially kids in those communities, can continue to have good opportunities, so that we can see more and more people rise up like JD was able to do. And anyway, thanks for being on this journey with us, and congrats to Kevin for hitting his 1,000th book, and we're excited for the next 1,000. So thank you for joining in with us, and we'll talk to you soon.